Hello, this is Steve Sanangelo from the SRS Rock Report, and today I've got an exciting interview today on the thermodynamic oil collapse and future. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Louis Arnoux. He is an engineer and scientist with over 50 years experience in energy transport, communications, infrastructure, and disruptive developments. Now, Lewis is also the main inventor of the NGENI class of technology catalysts, which is for the fourth transition initiative. So, Louis, how are you doing today?
Hello, Steve. Pretty good. Very glad to be talking with you and exploring all of these complex matters. And we're going to try and keep it very simple and clear for everybody.
Well, great, because the last time we spoke, it's been several years. A lot of people enjoyed our first interview, and things have changed. We're starting to see a lot more trouble with the oil industry. A lot of debt now is starting to pile up. It's becoming a lot more problematic to continue business as usual. And so, in this slide, we have the thermodynamic cliff. And before we get into the interview, would you mind explaining to the followers, to the watchers, listeners, in your terms, what is the thermodynamic oil collapse and what is thermodynamics? Simply in your terms.
Absolutely. Let's start with thermodynamics because that's a term many people are not familiar with. Thermodynamic is the science of accessing and using energy in a broader sense of the term. The knowledge of thermodynamics began to be developed in the very early days of the Industrial Revolution about 270 years ago in round numbers. At the time of the development of the first steam engines, like the new common engine, which was only about 1-2% efficient at the time, but it did do the job to pump water out of coal mines in the UK and started the Industrial Revolution. So thermodynamics is about how we use, how we access and use energy. Now, what very few people these days realize is that absolutely every single aspect of our lives is based on the knowledge of thermodynamics. In the background, you have engineers who have sufficiently studied thermodynamics to make things happen. So everything we do in a home, at work, in a supermarket, on the roads is built on 270 years of development of thermodynamics as a scientific discipline. A lot of scientists recognize that thermodynamics is the part of physics which which sustain the whole of science. Everything is dependent on thermodynamics. So our livelihood, how we heat, how we keep warm, how we maintain cooling in the summer, how we have hospitals, medicine, transport, everything we do and consume, it's based on the knowledge of thermodynamics. Without
And
that, we would not have the population we have today. The global population will still be less than 1 billion people.
okay, now I understand that. I understand the thermodynamic science, but can you explain that in very simple terms? What's happening when you say the thermodynamic of a system, like what's happening with the thermodynamic cliff, what we see right in front of us? What is actually happening with thermodynamics? If you use it in, let's say, a simple example for the public to understand. We understand you burn energy, you put your light switch on, the light goes on, you use energy for a manufacturing plant, and then you transport these manufacturing goods in a truck. But thermodynamically, what is going on? What does that mean to the simple person in the public?
Very simply, one of the main principles of thermodynamics says that there is no such thing as a free lunch. To use energy, one has to spend energy. and they are always waste. No matter what we do, we'll always have waste heat. So transporting someone by car, for example, if we look at the energy flows to achieve that, to go from A to B, in terms of the energy we collect out of an oil well somewhere around the world, uh, and all the way to transport one's body by road in a car, the energy efficiency is only at best 5%. And the balance, 95% of the energy is waste heat going up in the air and contributing to warm up the planet. So very people realize that, and that's why we now are on the edge of what you mentioned, the thermodynamic cliff, is we have been using fossil fuels now for about 270 years, but we have used them very inefficiently, and we keep using them very inefficiently. So that curve you see on the slide, the blue curve, is the profile of what has happened since the early days of the Industrial Revolution until now. By around 2015, we reached a peak, and now we are on the verge of going down a very steep cliff. That profile is called an energy Seneca. So it's why the slide mentioned the mother of all synergy, all Seneca effect. Seneca is a slow progress, a process of growth, ending in a peak and followed with an abrupt fall. It's named after the Roman philosopher Seneca, who first identified that profile. And what we are facing now is, because we have used energy very inefficiently, um, we are facing the prospect in the very near future of very abrupt collapse. That's what this slide shows. Unless we change route very abruptly, which is the green arrow on the top right-hand corner, there is still a possibility of avoiding collapse completely, but it means changing tack very, very rapidly.
Yes, and I thank you for explaining that. So basically, what we're going to get into, and we're going to show it towards the end of the interview, the possible solution. We've got it's almost a predicament, because if we continue on the fossil fuels, which is the main driver, it's either oil, coal, or natural gas. That's the main driver of the global economy, even though we have nuclear, hydro, and supposedly renewables. So now that's where we're at. We're at this little circle, this gold circle, and either we could go down it or we could transition and into something different. So what I want to do is get to the next slide.
Yeah, but
And
before we do that, Steve, can we still stay on that
sure,
slide? Just a final point here
sure.
to explain what the blue curve is about. The blue curve is actually uh, was actually produced by the Meadows in the early 1970s, when they tried to alert the world that we were on a very dangerous track. And at the time, almost nobody wanted to listen. But that curve is the projection they have in their model for industrial output globally. And it did show that, yeah, it will reach a peak and then abruptly fall. Um, they proved, at the time, it was just to illustrate the danger. It was not meant to be a forecast. But what we have observed decade after decade since the early 1970s is that the actual historical data about industrial output, about pollution, about global warming, and so on, has actually tracked very, very closely to that model and that blue curve. So this is why this is important. It's not hypothetical. In 1972, it was hypothetical. Now it's happening. The data shows that it is happening, and we are just at the edge of the cliff. That's the point I wanted to clarify.
No, I appreciate you doing that. And I guess what I've learned from looking at some more of your updated charts is that the energy that we've used it very inefficiently, and it's caused a lot of side
That,
effects. That's exactly
absolutely.
what, that's basically that it's it in a nutshell. Instead of using the energy very efficiently, we wouldn't have all these problems that we're dealing with. Is that correct?
That's correct. The source of our problem, and the global situation is now very dire, is essentially because we have applied thermodynamic knowledge very inefficiently. If we had done it more efficiently, we would not be in trouble. We could still be using fossil fuels for quite some time.
I see.
We are in trouble, we have climate emergency and so on, essentially because we have been very inefficient.
Well, I totally agree. And now I do like to get to the next slide, because what you're
But
trying to propose is basically we've had three, there's been three transitions in the human history. And you see, you've got the hunter gatherers, and then we moved, and the hunter gatherers had a pretty high energy return on investment. Some analysts say it was 10 to 1 energy return. That was the average. And then we moved to, as you show, early farmers. And and
yeah,
and so this slide shows that we've had three transitions, and now we're in the third one, and that's the fossil fuel based globalized industrial world. Would you explain this chart, please?
yes, Steve. So first, the let's backtrack about let's say in round numbers, 3 million years, the emergence of sophisticated hunter-gatherers. The just a point to clarify here, the energy return on energy investment of hunter-gatherers was 100 to 1. These guys had it actually pretty good. Obviously, you had to contend with lions and a few other things, animals, but and grizzly bears and so on. But they could live a relatively comfortable life by working only about 2-3 hours a day. It was primitive, but they were on average healthy and tall. The average lifespan was about 60 years. Then about 10,000 years ago, farming was invented. And interestingly enough, for the bulk of the population, internal rate of returns for energy went down around 20-30 to 1. The lifespan of people went down to about 25 years old, and their status, they were a lot shorter and much more prone to disease. For most people, development of farming was not necessarily a good thing. The point is that the chief honchos, the leaders of those populations, had it better because they had effectively slaves by whatever name working for them, and they lived comfortable lives and lived longer. But the transition was not necessarily the best thing in the world for most people. Now, if we move a bit forward at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 270 years ago, something similar happened. We started using coal initially, and then oil, natural gas, and so on. And for most people, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was a pretty tough change, with a very hard life for the majority. But the people on top of the pyramid, at the top, the leaders, the so-called capitalists and so on, had a good time. Nonetheless, the whole process of accessing a huge energy pool of fossil fuels is what enabled the enormous surge in the global population. So we moved from less than 1 billion people at the time, about 800 million, to now around 7.8, trending towards 8 billion people globally. And at the same time, right now, we have reached the end of that road and we are on the verge of sliding down a thermodynamic cliff, as you see on the slide. With a difference with previous transitions is that before, when there was a collapse of some sort, a civilization was collapsing, most people could still fall back on subsistence farming or hunting and gathering. In our case, this is gone. With no longer a safe, for most people on the planet, there is no longer a safety net to fall back onto. So the prospect of missing the boat and sliding down the cliff, if I can cross my metaphors, is very dire. So the challenge we face now is, can we achieve a fourth transition to something else right now, very quickly? If we don't do that, we go back to worse than medieval times. We go back to some people, some of my colleagues talk of the Stone Age, obviously metaphorically, but it will be very dire. Each time there has been a transition, there has been, people have been accessing a larger energy pool. When you move from hunting gathering to farming, okay, the living conditions might not be better, but globally the civilization was accessing a larger energy pool than the hunters, growing crops like wheat or the ancestors of wheat and rice and so on. When we move from farming and biomass and forestry to fossil fuels, we accessed a very large energy pool. Now, that option is finished. We should not have any illusion, and we'll explain that better in a few minutes. Fossil fuels are finished. There's plenty of fossil fuels in the ground, but in terms of being able to survive with that, it's finished. And we need to access a large energy pool. Otherwise, we go down the cliff. Now, that energy pool exists. It's called the sun, but not the way we're accessing the sun at the moment. And this is where my work comes in. How can we access solar energy? There is a huge abundance of solar energy worldwide. How can we access it efficiently and effectively and very quickly? That's the challenge. That's why there is this big question mark on the slide.
Thank you. I see that question mark, and I guess the best way to explain what you're trying to do is that your solar technology is efficient and smart, and the solar panels that we're using or we're trying to transition to is inefficient and stupid. It really comes down to that. It basically, yeah,
absolutely.
So I think people need to understand, when you talk about solar, you're talking about solar technology in a much more efficient use. But the way we're using solar panels today, it's still in that very inefficient energy system.
Absolutely. I mean, with solar panels, and it's the same for wind turbines, we're actually not changing the game. You know, the current global energy system we have at the moment are 12% efficient.
Okay, now we're going to get into that. I don't want you. That's like a movie. We're going to get into that in a minute. But what I do to lay the groundwork.
No, let me explain that point to answer your question. You know, we started with steam engines, which were 1-2% efficient. 270 years later, we have a system which is far more complex globally, but which is only 12% efficient. Now, when we use solar panels or wind turbines, the overall efficiency of the system hasn't changed. It's still around 12%. And that's why solar, the way we do it at the moment, or wind, is no solution. We changed a few pieces of gear, but we are not changing the overall efficiency.
That's correct. And we're going to get into that in detail here in a minute. And so I think one thing that a lot of people, I'm on Twitter, I do some debating on Twitter when I hear comments from people they think that we're going to transition to more solar and wind, but the problem is it takes the burning of a lot of natural gas, coal, and oil to produce the solar and wind powered units. And I think that's the problem with people today. They're very smart, even engineers who are pushing these renewable or these solar and wind power units. They're very smart in the production and engineering of it, but it's still very inefficient. So I think I'm still surprised that we're seeing that come from engineers, aren't you?
Yes and no. I mean, engineers, as you just pointed out, are very specialized. I mean, designing a wind turbine is very specialized. Um, you have engineers who are designing only the profile of a blade of a wind turbine. That's what they do. And other engineers are designing the gear for the turbine. Others are designing the power generator, which transform the mechanical power of the turbine into electricity and so on. It's very, very specialized, very fragmented. And very few people are actually focusing on doing the sums for the whole system, not just one turbine, but thousands of turbines, millions of turbines, and looking at the process from mine to grave. Eventually, those pieces of gear have to be disposed of, recycled, or just dumped. And the problem is to look at the full system over a period of time from mine to grave. When you do the sums that way, you realize that there is absolutely no way that wind and solar, the way it's done at the moment, can actually get us out of trouble.
Yeah, it seems to it makes the problem worse, and that's what I say. It's not a solution. It's making the problem worse. So now,
If I can add a tiny point of paradox there, because some colleagues of mine have actually done the sums, including for the US. If one were to use a large number of wind turbines to replace a substantial part of fossil energy use in the US, the impact on the wind will be such that it will actually warm up the US by nearly a quarter of a degree. And people, it's paradoxical, it's counterintuitive. If you put a lot of wind turbine, you create a lot of turbulences, you slow down the wind, and first principle of thermodynamics says that energy is never destroyed, it's never created, it changes form. If you slow down the wind, well, you warm up the area downwind. So definitely wind on a large scale is not a solution to combat global warming. You actually contribute to global warming if you do that.
yeah, and again, this is the problem with using these solutions that aren't really solutions. They just add to the problem. And so I
Yeah.
appreciate you pointing it out. But again, we're going to get into that in more detail here in a few minutes. But I wanted to get into quickly nuts and bolts about the thermodynamics decline of oil. And you would agree that oil is the main driver of the global economy. It allows for natural gas and coal to be extracted as well as produced if you need oil to do those other energy sources. And this chart, I use it quite a bit because I'm trying to reconnect these energy dots that have been destroyed due to the complexity of our supply chain and our energy system. Now, the falling EROI is a guideline, but as you have told me, this is similar. The net energy consumed and remaining is a parallel to what you call the thermodynamic cliff. And so while the EROI gives us a basic guideline of what's happening, that's what it is. And you say that the thermodynamics is more a complete understanding of what's happening. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think the point is to differentiate between the concept of ROI, energy return on energy investment, and then empirically actually trying to compute what it may be at a given point in time, how it is evolving for a country or globally. So the concept of EROI is very easy to understand. I think to get energy, you need to spend energy. There's no free lunch, and therefore what matters is how much you have left when you have spent some energy. So it's a net energy surplus, and the EROI is this ratio between how much you get and how much you have invested. So if you invest 1 unit and you get 10 unit backs, apparently it's a good deal. It depends on the system which this applies to. And this is something which your diagram shows there, but few people realize, is that an EROI of 10 to 1 or 11 to 1, like at the tip of your diagram, is, it's important to mention it, it's actually at the wellhead.
Right.
And a lot of energy is also spent downstream to transport the oil, to refine it, to distribute the end products in the form of diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, and so on and so forth. So a ratio of 10 to 1 at the wellhead is the very bare minimum required to have an industrial society. And what that means is that if you go below that, and right now, globally, my estimate is we are below 10 to 1. The lifestyle you get very rapidly is something like farmers in North Korea. Not the sort of lifestyle we would like to live in. To live comfortably for a period of time, you need to be above 30 to 1 at the wellhead. And we drop below 40 to 1 at the turn of the 20th, from the 20th to the 21st century. So we are in dark trouble. We can't stay below 10 to 1 for very long without very, very nasty consequences.
Yeah, and I think so. It's and the energy return on investment doesn't really take into the inefficiency, correct? The problem, the inefficiency of the
Yeah,
use of the energy.
implicitly it does. You know, if to have a high return on energy investment above 30 to 1, we have to be super efficient. And at the moment, we are not. With the oil we are using, we could be above 30 to 1, but not with the technology mix we are using.
I see now.
That's what people don't realize. It could be different. We are in that situation because nobody has effectively bothered to improve efficiency, not just at the level of one unit, like one type of engine for one given car, but for the entire energy supply chain from, say, oil exploration all the way to using that car on the road. You know, a car engine now is as efficient as it can be for most cars. This is why we have had the diesel, so-called diesel gate with the main automotive manufacturers, because they had reached the limit of what they could do, and they could no longer actually meet the regulations imposed upon them by various governments. So what they did was to cheat, because there was nothing else they could do. In terms of engineering, the internal combustion engine, whether it's gasoline or diesel, have reached their limit. But it still means that the total energy chain from the well to transporting somebody is what I said before, is still around 5%. If you're stuck in a traffic jam, it will go down to 3 or 2%.
Yeah, and so I think I've heard that the energy return on investment of a gallon of gasoline at the pump is 5 to 1. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, it's something in that order. I mean, varies from country to country
Yes.
a bit.
But
But globally, it's that order of magnitude, in my view. Yes.
so if it comes out 10 to 1 or 11 to 1, by the time that gasoline gets to the pump, it's down to 5 to 1. And then there's all the problems with the waste heat from the engine and sitting in traffic. So I understand that. And now that's where we're going to get to the next slide, which is the famous oil barrel. And this is a chart that we did
Yes.
talk about, and it's called scraping the bottom of the barrel. And I'm just going to briefly explain it and allow you to go in a little bit more detail. But the blue area of the oil, and that's on this diagram, the blue area, and we've got three different periods: 1900, 2015, which you show as the peak, and then about 2030 when this runs into a lot of trouble. But the blue part is that waste heat. We don't access that part. And as over the time has gone by, the energy that available to the economy has gone down, which is the red. Would you explain these three different colors and what's happened and why it's falling so quickly now, Louis?
Uh, Thank you. Yes, the as you said, the blue part is the waste heat. There is absolutely nothing we can do. If we convert energy from one form to another, there is always going to be waste heat. It's the second principle of thermodynamics. And for oil, with the technology mix we are currently using, it's a good third. It's a bit more than a third of the barrel, which is going to be wasted no matter what. And what's left is called the available work one can have out of a barrel of conventional oil. Why conventional oil? Because that's the best barrel available. If we use heavy oil or if we use light tight oil, also known as shale oil, the situation is worse. So what we're looking on that diagram is the best case. And the total amount of work available from a barrel is what's below the blue arrows. And that has to be split between the oil industry and the end users. Whether the end users are people like you and me, or an industry or a company running buses or airplanes or whatever, the yellow part is the energy used by the industry to deliver net energy to the rest of us. And in the early days, still around the turn of the 20th century, the 1900, the oil which was extracted from relatively easy, good quality oil fields, and it was not transported very much, which meant that about 61% of the energy, the gross energy in a barrel, was available to the end users. And that was what was used to effectively enable the growth of GDP and so on. As depletion of oil field progressed, one had to go much deeper and in more and more remote places and more difficult places. And therefore the industry had to spend a lot more energy to keep delivering oil and products, which meant that by 2015, our best estimate is that the net energy per barrel available for the global economy was about 8%. And that over the next few years, it will go down to 0%. Our best estimate at the moment is that actually the per average barrel of sweet crude, we hit the 0% around 2022, but there are ways and means of extending that. So to be on the safe side here on our diagram, we say that 0% is definitely around 2030. And that's very, very important, very serious, because as you were saying, Steve, at the moment, to have access to all the other forms of energy, we need net energy from oil. It's like an inverted pyramid resting on its tip. To get coal, we need net energy from oil. To get natural gas, to get nuclear, to get biomass, to get wind, solar, feed for animals, and food for people. It's all energy. We need net energy from oil. And if it goes down to zero, well, we have collapse. Not just collapse of the oil industry, we have collapse globally of the global industrial civilization. This is what we are looking at the moment.
Yeah, and I write about and do some charts on some of the. I follow the shale industry, and that I call it. It's like a Ponzi scheme. It's a black hole, and it did bring on a lot of this energy, but it was a very high cost. And now even the major companies, the majors like ExxonMobil and BP and Shell, they're starting to get into trouble. I mean, Exxon, as it started to go into shale in the last 4 or 5 years and ramp up the shale energy, its U.S. Sector, its oil and gas sector, has been a big loser, and so now they're borrowing money just to pay dividends, and so they're borrowing a lot of money, $20 billion this first half of the year. So we're seeing that the majors now are getting into big trouble, and there's I think we're going to see that even become much more of an issue moving forward. Now, what I want to do is to go to the next slide, which
Mhm.
basically it's a chart form of this barrel. Basically, what you have is you have the barrel shown in a chart form, and you've got the 6.2 gigajoules per barrel. That is the top of the barrel, right? Oh, actually, that is the where the energy that you could use. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the gross energy available in the barrel. And the estimates can vary, depends how you look at the statistics and which statistics one uses in terms of conventional oil. But in our estimate, it's around 6.2 gigajoules per barrel. That's the gross energy.
And so
And
the are you saying the
yeah,
energy between the 3.85 and the 6.2, we can't even use that right now?
that's right. That is in blue. It corresponds to the blue arrows in the previous diagram with the barrel. It's the waste heat we are going to release to the environment, no matter what we do, to be able to actually extract the oil out of the ground and then transport it, use it, and so on. We will have to have waste heat. So the amount of work we can actually get out of a barrel is around 3.85 gigajoules per barrel. That's the ceiling. This is the red line across the diagram, and that amount has to be split between the industry and the end users. So the orange line you see starting from close to zero around 1900 and climbing is our estimates of how much energy the industry uses in total to deliver net energy to the rest of the world. And the net energy is that the gap between the ceiling and the orange line.
And it's interesting. I wish I just thought about it. It would have been a great chart, a graphic to show. Back in the 1900s, a simple oil derrick, you had a few people, a few workers on a simple oil derrick. And now, if you look at what it takes to frack a typical oil well, one oil well, there are a dozen or two dozen, a dozen, maybe even 14 of these semi-tractor trailers, and they're all lined up, the trailers, and they have these pumping units to pump in the fracking sand. And so it's amazing how much more of the technology, energy that is used to get that shale oil. So I think people don't get that. Back in the day when they were drilling into the high quality conventional oil, it was a very simple system. Now
Hmm.
it's very complex, and so that's what's taking up. As the arrow has moved up, the industry is just using a lot more energy to get that energy, correct?
Absolutely. And shale oil, as you just said, is a good example. In a global term, each barrel extracted requires more energy to extract, transport, and process than all the previous barrels. And another way of highlighting how complex it has become and how much energy and cost it requires is to look at the Middle East, countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Before oil, Saudi Arabia had about a maximum of 2 million people in it living there. Essentially traditional subsistence levels, some coastal fishing, obviously the pilgrimage in Mecca, and that's about it. In Kuwait, similar things. Kuwait is very flat, it's sandy, it's hardly more than a meter above sea level, which means that with climate warming, prospects are not very good because sea level is going up. But their one of the main sources of livelihood before oil was fishing pearls in the Arabian Gulf until the Japanese invented pearl culture, which made a very tough competition. So the advent of oil changed those countries. We are now talking of about 30 million people. And what one needs to understand is that 30 million people in that part of the world is what is required to maintain the production level around 10 to 11 million barrels per day. And it's more complicated than that because those 30 million odd people to live and do their job. And that's not just all engineers and workers, but it's lawyers, it's dentists, it's school teachers, and so on, and Filipino domestics and the like. To get them to live in that part of the world requires importing everything, nearly everything. The whole of the technology for the oil industry, but also the computers, the food, all the amenities, the health facilities, everything is imported. And you have, I estimate that there is a factor of 10. So for 10 million people in that part of the world, you need somewhere else 100 million people as a support system. So to maintain, to achieve, it gives us an idea of how the oil industry works globally. To achieve 10 million barrels per day, you need something like 280, 300 million people somewhere in the world dedicated to that.
Yeah, I think that's what the market doesn't understand, right? That's the complexity, and I believe we're going to get into that in the next slide. And that's the total system, and you call it the PPS. And what does the PPS mean?
That was an acronym put forward by a colleague of mine, Bedford. It means petroleum production system. It's much more than the just the oil refinery, the oil rigs, and the tankers. Is that plus the entire support systems and the people required for the oil industry to actually deliver net energy to the rest of the world. The case of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait shows that globally, if we extrapolate, globally, there are at least 2 billion people who are required to actually make it possible for the oil industry to deliver end products. Well, that's a lot of energy, but nobody computes it. When people do financial analysis or count barrels, they don't pay attention to, it's like a hidden part of the iceberg. They see only the tip of the iceberg. They don't see that below that, unseen, there is a huge amount of people and a huge amount of energy required.
Yes, to make the oil industry functional. And I really want to get into that next slide that comes from one of your the papers. And and I think you're right. This is the main problem that we just look at the oil industry. And let me make an example. When the pandemic hit, I put on CNBC, a financial network, and they were a lot of these analysts that used to come into the actual CNBC headquarters and do their interviews. They were all working at home, and there was 5 of them up on the screen. And one gentleman said, you know what, with the oil price falling, I'm not, I don't care about energy. It's only 2% of the S&P 500. It's underperforming the market. Why would anybody want to invest in energy or energy stocks? So he was a big, he did not believe in energy, but unfortunately, without that 2%, there is no S&P 500. And so I think this is the training, the mentality of the financial and the economists. They just look at the energy as it's separate. It's like the automobile industry, like the housing industry, the retail industry, the farming industry. It's not. It makes everything work. And so what you're saying in this chart, even though you've got the extracting, transportation, pipeline, storage, processing, and then transportation and distribution, that that's much more complex than just that part of the oil industry. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's why I was using the metaphor of the iceberg. People like the finance people you just referred to, they only see the tip of the iceberg. They don't see the huge amount of huge part of the economy which is necessary for the energy to be delivered at the end of the day. That diagram shows that only effectively at the moment, only a trickle of energy reaches the end users on the right-hand side of the diagram. The bulk of the energy is used by the industry and the support system of the industry to actually keep operating. Now, the fundamental point economists don't understand is that to have a civilization, you need a self-powered energy supply chain. Self-power means that you use energy to get energy, and what you deliver is the surplus. If the supply chain you use is not self-powered, you have civilization collapse. And that has happened a number of times historically in the past. It's the first time it's going to happen with fossil fuels, but it has happened quite a number of times when in societies, civilizations, and empire were built effectively on biomass, which is effectively solar energy transformed through photosynthesis. So the collapse has happened historically a number of times, about 90 times from memory. We are on the verge of the first collapse of a civilization built on fossil fuels. What is critical is to have a self-powered energy supply chain. And that's what we are in the process of losing at the moment. People are focusing on climate change and so on. It's vital, it's very important, but that's only the symptom. The actual problem is we are in the process of losing the energy foundation for our world. We are in the process of losing the one and only self-powered energy supply chain we have, which is oil-based. Everything else is depending on that. So if we lose the oil, net energy from oil, which we are in the process of losing now, we lose everything. That's what this diagram is showing.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? I had a recent interview, and they asked me about the renewables, and I said, you know, it's not just the renewables, because you need diesel in all these trucks that go out and bring all this equipment. I mean, it's hundreds of trucks, semi-tractor trailer loads to frack a shale gas well. And then, of course, in the coal industry, how do you get the coal out of the ground? You use diesel machines. Now, Germany uses a huge bucket excavator. That's electricity driven, but still, in most places in the world, using diesel powered equipment to extract the coal, and then it's transported by rail or barge, and those are diesel run machines, correct?
That's right, in the main. And even if some of it is using electricity, like you mentioned, the lignite excavators used in Germany, is still not solving the problem, because to have those power stations operating, you still need transport. You still need people to move about and go to work in the morning, and then go by car mostly, or by bus, or by means of transport That requires diesel and gasoline. And also you need to transport the equipment, you need to transport the maintenance gear and so on. So the whole system relies, regardless of any other consideration, the whole system relies on transport fuels, which are oil derived. The same for wind turbines. The wind turbines have to be moved around, the people have to be moved around. When they go and build a large wind farm offshore, well, you need boats, and those boats or ships to transport the thing, transport the personnel, maintain things. They're all diesel fueled or bunker fueled.
Yeah, they were bunker. Now I guess the new law says that it has to move to the cleaner diesel, which is going to be hard because there's a lot of bunker fuel that's as a byproduct in the refining industry. And now to make diesel, that's going to be more of an issue for the transportation industry. Now, one of the
Yes.
things one of the things that we get I get asked a lot about, and this is
Mhm.
the next thing we're going to talk about, because I believe so many people have been trained to think that if the supply of oil is going to fall due to the thermodynamic oil collapse or decline, that means the price is going to go up. That is the knee-jerk reaction that you hear from economists, analysts, and even the public who has been trained to believe that way by going to college and school and listening to it on TV. So this next slide. Oh, actually, before we get to that, we're
Mhm.
going to do the oil age in perspective. Now, I want to get to the supply and demand and what actually causes or is the driver of the oil price.
Mhm.
But before I get into
Yes.
that, this is your famous chart. I post this quite a bit to get people to understand what's happening with the age of oil. Would you mind explaining this briefly on what's happening with the different color? The different color, you got one arrow, which is the net energy. You've got the GDP in debt and the oil production. Would you explain these colors, graph lines, and what's happening currently?
Yes, thanks, Steve. Yes, absolutely. That chart translates for the global situation, the previous chart about the oil barrel and what happens per barrel. So once we understand what happens per barrel, if we look at the total oil production and consumption, this is what that chart describes. So the top part is the blue line, which is derived from the statistics from BP oil. Uh, it's the amount of total crude produced per year after year after year. And we see that after the early 70s, it goes through a series of bumps, but it keeps going up and up. And that blue line is very tightly correlated with the growth of GDP worldwide. So when people look at GDP, they see that, oh, it's going up, everything is fine. However, if we look at what that means in net energy terms, we get a very different picture, because we don't use the crude oil, we use net energy from oil, which is the green line, which is much lower because of the waste heat, as we have discussed before. And that amount of net energy from oil is split between the industry and the end user. And what gets to the end user is the orange line. Now we see that because of the depletion issues we have discussed before, by the early 1980s, net energy, the total amount of net energy actually delivered to the non-oil part of the global economy starts to go down. It's what is called by sometimes the Red Queen effect, from Alice in Wonderland. In one, yeah. Um, to the Red Queen says that to keep moving, one has to run faster and faster, otherwise one backtracks. So the oil industry has to pump more and more and more and more, faster and faster, to keep staying in the same place or to keep delivering net energy to the rest of the world. But it reaches a point where it can't keep doing this. And that point was reached in our estimates in the early 1980s. And things have been getting worse and worse ever since. Now, the interesting bit about this is the red diagrams there, which is derived from Bank of America Merrill Lynch, is the percent of world debt in terms of GDP. You see that it was growing, but very slowly. It was very flattish until the early 1980s. And then suddenly it starts shooting towards the sky, towards the stars. It's now well above 240% of world GDP. And that world debt taking off is precisely starts at the moment when the total amount of net energy from oil delivered to the world starts declining. And the two go together. In other terms, the world has been living on credit for a long time in a way which it can't afford, in a way which will never be able to be reimbursed. That debt is largely delusional because it has now reached a point where it cannot be serviced, not let alone reimbursed. And the very dangerous part is, as you can see on the diagram on the bottom right-hand corner, the situation is trending towards zero. And when we reach zero net energy, as we said before, everything grinds to a halt and people get very, very unhappy about it.
And so what happens then the debt is being offset by the falling net energy. And when the net energy gets down to such a low number, they're lowering in interest rates because with high interest rates, you can't service this debt. But at some point in time, the debt's going to implode and so will all these assets or supposed assets, which are mostly stocks, bonds, and real estate. And so that's kind of the crazy situation that the world has been moving towards. It's I call it is the energy cliff. And so moving forward, thank you for explaining that. So let me
just point to Steve there just before moving to the next slide. And I'm sure we will talk more about it later on. But what this amount of data shows, and what I'm going to say there sounds rather enormous and hard for a lot of people to swallow. But what is being revealed by the current global situation, but what the data is showing, is that the whole of economics is pure fantasy. The economics as is taught in universities is a fantasy about a perpetual motion machine in full contradiction with thermodynamics. And you can't do that for very long. After a while, you reach the end of that road and everything breaks down. One cannot go against thermodynamics. And that's what that diagram is showing. It's the whole of economics is a pure fantasy.
Now, before we do get to the next slide, and we're going to talk about the oil price, because that it seems to be, I've heard this said that people don't really care about energy. What they care about is the bill they get, right? The oil bill, either in the mail or what they're going to pay at the gas pump. But if as we move forward, let's say that the technology that you're trying to introduce to transition away from this thermodynamic cliff, if that does not happen, what is the world going to experience? What are we going to see? What examples could you give us as the net energy continues to fall? What will we see happen in the global economy and market?
Yes, thank you, Steve. That's why I was mentioning the fantasy of economics, because as you pointed out, a lot of practically every economist don't understand the energy situation. They don't understand thermodynamics. So that's why it's important to stress that. We have known that for a long time. To my knowledge, the first economists who actually raised the matter was a US economist who was born in Central Europe, Nicola Georgescu Rogan, and he became famous in the 50s for effectively shaking things up a bit by pointing that out, pointing that economics, sorry, the way it was taught and the way it's still taught uh, was in contradiction with thermodynamics. He created a bit of stir, but he was an economist. He did not fully understand thermodynamics and he made some mistakes. So the matter kept lingering and it didn't obviously achieve much in terms of what he was trying to highlight. But decade after decade, the matter has been explored and analyzed further. One of my friends, emeritus professor of economics in France, Serge Latouche, spent most of his career demonstrating that, and demonstrating economics is not a science. And now people have been ignoring that willfully for quite some time, but now it's catching up with everybody. We are finding ourselves at the edge of the cliff. So yes, we can see the next slide if you like, Steve, and we'll discuss that a bit more.
Okay. All right. Now, this is just a simple graphic because again, when I talk about these concepts, and there are concepts that people tend to react, well, if the supply of oil is going to fall, then the price is going to go up. Now, why in the next slide you have a different approach on the price of oil? You said oil prices are not based on supply and demand. Well, let's put it this way: supply and demand are impacting what the market is pricing on a short-term basis. So it does impact the price as it's being traded on a short-term basis. But if we're looking at the oil price on a long-term basis, it's thermodynamically driven. So could you explain what the blue line and the red line mean in this chart?
Absolutely. I mean, the wiggly pale blue line behind that is, as you were saying, Steve, the day to day, weekend after week, and year after year fluctuation of the benchmark for oil. There are two main benchmarks, the WTI in the US and Brent worldwide, but they follow closely each other. The point is that that's what people who trade oil do. The vast majority of oil traders haven't got a clue whatsoever on how the oil industry actually works, and they don't have a clue about thermodynamics. So their job is to make money by buying and selling oil, and sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. When they get it wrong, it costs them dearly, but by and large, they fly blind. So as you were saying, what's important is to look at the picture in the longer run. Now, the big blue line shooting up towards the sky is how it was before around 2010, 2012. In other terms, the oil price was based on the oil cost to end users. In other terms, the industry could charge a price corresponding to what the energy cost of delivering net energy to the end user. And the end user was able to pay for that. This is why we call it a societal cost to end user. There was enough net energy per barrel to fuel the global economy. Everything was going fine. People could afford that, and the price could go up and up in tune with the increasing energy cost of delivering net energy. The problem is that around 2010, 2012, something else happened, which is the red line, the red arrow. That's the maximum amount of cost the economy, the global, the non-oil part of the economy could afford to make money. And that has been declining for a long time until 2010, 2012. It didn't matter much because that affordability cost was much higher. So people didn't even notice that. People didn't know there was a maximum affordable oil price until net energy per barrel was low enough. Because you don't make money with crude, you make money with the net energy from the crude. If the net energy goes too low, there is little amount of GDP you can generate per barrel. And if you extrapolate that to the end term, if there is no net energy per barrel, there's no amount of GDP you can generate per barrel. You can't do anything with it because you have no net energy. So at that point, which is very near now, the oil has absolutely zero value. It stays in the ground. Oil has value if you can generate net energy and use that to generate economic growth. If you can't do that, the barrel is of no interest at all for anybody. So the red curve shows the trend towards that endpoint. And we can see the wiggly blue line at the back since 2008 effectively has been trending down. And it will keep fluctuating. It will go up and down, but on average, over a long period of time, it's trending towards the floor. And that's a direct consequence of the fact that thanks to the depletion process, net energy is going down the floor.
So the real oil price is based upon the available net energy. And is that
It's
correct?
based upon what can be used to generate growth. It can't be used to generate growth. It has no value. It's as simple as that. And that's what economists don't understand. They think in terms of supply and demand in very simplistic, very naive terms. They confuse the demand for crude, which take place through millions of transactions every day, for huge different numbers of different quality of oil, for different types of refineries configured in very different ways. And that is averaged into the WTI or the Brent crude price, the benchmarks. But that tells nothing about the reality of the oil industry. So it's a way for people making money if they are lucky and clever enough. But it doesn't tell us anything about the global situation and where we are headed.
So if it's true that the price that's affordable to the public or the market, if it continues to decline, that then what we're going to see at the same time is a bankruptcy, an increased bankruptcy of the global oil industry and a decline in global oil production. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. Now, two points there to mention. The first is the pandemic, the COVID pandemic has accelerated the process because obviously suddenly people were locked down and they were not using transport fuels for driving, for flying, for everything, which has been a huge shock to the oil industry. And in the meantime, global warming, the climate emergency has been biting a heck of a lot more. So effectively, a number of oil majors have finally flipped. And that is probably more visible in Europe than in the US. But the combination of those various events, the pandemic and its consequences, and the various obvious climate change impacts, the huge fire, the huge floods, the huge droughts, and so on, have prompted Shell, BP, and in France, Total, Eni in Italy, and the Spanish equivalent to actually change the strategy. Over the last 6 months, there's been a major strategic change. And it's paradoxical. The official discourse of us majors is now almost day and night compared with how it was at the same time last year. They all saying we are going to green ourselves, we are going to invest massively in so-called renewables and a shift from relying almost exclusively on oil and gas towards electricity and so on. Now, the huge paradox of that is that their strategy, I mean, the way they are announcing it, is to focus on so-called renewables, while we also know actually that those renewables can't deliver what they say they want to deliver. And the paradox is that they keep analyzing things in financial terms, which actually mask the reality. They're not yet analyzing things in thermodynamic terms. If they were analyzing in thermodynamic terms, there were no way they would invest in developing wind farms and solar farms and offshore wind and so on. So in fact, they go from one problem, they jumped into another one to avoid the first problem. They have finally understood that the oil age is finishing, no matter what. And to get out of trouble, they're actually jumping into another form of trouble. And it's this whole paradox of the situation.
Yeah, I've been seeing that happen, and it's we really do need the oil, which is to make the transition. But what they're starting to transition to, or they're trying to change to, is to move to the inefficient renewable or solar and wind, and get out of the oil when they should be getting out of the oil and getting into a more efficient system. And so, yeah, I see it. I see that as a major paradox, and unfortunately, that's where the major oil industry seems to be headed in that direction.
Certainly in Europe, it's the case, and also in various parts of Asia. I mean, I think Exxon is still plumping for oil, and in my view, it's head buried in the sand. But eventually, they will all have to face reality.
Crazy times. All right, what I want to do, because a lot of my followers are interested in precious metals, and it I first got interested in precious metals due to the problem with debt and money. But as I got to understand what it costs to produce the metals, and then the major factor in the cost to produce the metals is energy. And so then when you start looking at money, and that's what we use today, we call it money. It's really currency. But uh, I wanted to ask you your opinion. Uh, I've been labeling silver and gold as banks of energy equivalent value, because if you have a 1 ounce gold coin or a 1 ounce silver coin, it took all this energy in all forms and in all stages to create that coin. And so if it's in your pocket, or if it's in your vault or a safe or whatever, that coin is a representation of this stored energy equivalent value. And it's been doing that for thousands of years. Nothing has changed. So what is your opinion of the precious metals and how they act as money compared? And we'll get to the dollars and fiat money in the next slide. But is your analysis or understanding of silver and gold, the precious metals?
Uh, Absolutely, Steve. You're right that for thousands of years, gold and silver by weight, effectively, have been a proxy for energy as a means of storing the perceived value of energy for a given civilization. Whether it was the Greeks, the Roman civilization, or European civilization, or Chinese and so on, gold and precious metals, and essentially gold and silver, have been used as a proxy to store energy. And one can see that with food in very approximate term. A cartload of wheat at the peak of the Roman Empire um, was converted in silver, the Roman denarius, to about the same as the current conversion of wheat in silver terms right now. Obviously, through fluctuations, but the orders of magnitude are very similar. So, and wheat is energy in the form of food for people. So when you go down to the essentials that way, yes, there is a correspondence between the use of precious metal like gold and silver and the energy supplies system in a given civilization. However, there is a point where things can change, and this is where when one enters in the gray area about collapse, things can happen in very unpredictable way, and one has to be very cautious about what one is doing. The point being that archaeologists keep finding holds of precious metals, coin, bundles, big bits and pieces of silver and other things, and gold. When people try to hide their treasure, and then the treasures were lost because the people who hid them were killed or had to migrate, and all sorts of things happened. The problem is, in a given society, it's very dangerous and very difficult at times to preserve value. Gold and silver are very good stores of value. The problem is how to ensure one retains one's hands on it, if I can put it that way.
No,
I can
and
give you an example from the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age civilization ended up very abruptly about 2,300 years ago. No, sorry, 3,200 years ago. Now, in various parts of Europe, in French Brittany, amongst others, you find, archaeologists find sometimes stores of bronze axle. Those bronze axle were totally useless as an axe to chop wood or whatever. They contain a fair amount, a high level of lead, and they were not used as tools. Those axes, they used as a store of value. They were not quite a currency, but was a quasi-currency, but were a store of value. And at the collapse of the Bronze Age, those holds of bronze axes were abandoned and lost, and people completely forgot about them and what they meant. So yes, gold, silver are very important, but how societies are going to handle them and use them in the near future is faced with a big question mark.
no, I understand that. There's always the issue of we could say the same thing for food, right? If times
Yes.
get tough and you grow food, they could take your food. So, but let me ask you this question before we move to the next slide. If you had a choice if you had wealth to protect, either in a 401k or in a paper pension plan, or in money in the bank, or in gold or silver, would you which one would you choose, even though you don't really know what the options are going to be? Now there's other things you could do with your investments. You could buy a bigger farm. I'm not putting that option in this question here, but if you had to choose between paper assets, financial assets, or precious metals, even though you're not quite sure what the options are going to be, what is the wiser choice?
I would not hesitate. Precious metals.
Because again,
The current financial system worldwide, in my view, is bankrupt. if you analyze the whatever currency you want to consider, whether it's US dollars, the euro, the yuan, or the yen in Japan, and so on, those currencies currently have, in my view, absolutely no value whatsoever. They are useful in terms of instant transaction if you want to buy a bar of chocolate or whatever, um, or refill your tank while there is still gasoline or diesel at the petrol pump. You can do that. But in terms of storing value for the medium to long term, they have absolutely zero value because they are built on debt, and the value of a currency depends on the ability of a society to service the debt. And in the medium term now, because of what we have seen about energy and oil, the ability to service the debt is zilch. So effectively, people don't realize, but they are handling currencies which have no value whatsoever. So
Well,
I would not hesitate. I'm saying silver and gold, yes, absolutely.
and that's great because I should go to the next slide because that's exactly what you said. The energy, the dollars basically, anytime there's something that has a note written on it, that's not an asset. That is a liability. A note is something you owe. And now, so what you're seeing is the dollars aren't backed by gold; they're backed by a debt. The U.S. Treasury has over, I think, close to 27 trillion of it now, and then that's the EU and all these different countries that have their own debt. So what you're saying is the currency is backed by debt. So it's a claim on future energy production.
That's right, absolutely. And because that is now, um, well, I wouldn't say open-ended. The door to the future is closed. At the moment, we cannot guarantee uh, future energy production in such a way that the debt can be serviced. And that's something all finance people do miss. Even critical people like Rubini and so on, they still miss that point.
Yeah, I say this quite a bit, and a lot of my followers now, people who subscribe to the SRS Rock Report, and a lot of the people who've been following my work, they say, he never brings up energy. And it's like, how can you analyze something if you don't bring up energy? Because if the electricity gets shut off at your house for a day or 2 days or a week, I mean, if it gets shut off for half the day, people are concerned because they can't do anything. They can't
Mm,
use any of the systems, the TV, the washer and dryer. They can't cook if they're using the electricity or the gas. So people just tend to forget about the energy. And so I do believe it's amazing how we hear all this analysis from all these different individuals, economists, financial people, even energy people, and they totally miss the most important aspect, which is the energy is the number one driver of the economy.
exactly. And I mean, I can give two examples. I've lived this sort of situation a few times personally. When I was a kid, excuse me, I was living in Normandy at the time when the Suez Canal was taken over by Nasser in Egypt. And the British, the French, and the Israeli didn't like that. So they raided the place to reopen the canal. And that created an energy shock, at least in Europe. So within days, we had rationing coupons. Um, in my experience at the time, it didn't affect us where I was living because the food was still arriving, the bulk of the food was still arriving in the city by horse and carts to the main market. So transport fuel supplies were not yet an issue at that time. Fast forward to the second oil shock in 1973, I was managing the New Zealand Energy Research Program there. And New Zealand had and still has only one refinery. And the bulk of the oil, around 80, 90% of the oil there was coming from Iran, and there was a blockade. And practically overnight, the oil supply stopped. And suddenly we had carless days and everybody was very unhappy. And the Minister of Energy at the time was on the phone saying, guys, do something, but I need votes and I need you to find a solution. And we did. We created the CNG industry, compressed natural gas for transport, to improve the situation and convert part of the New Zealand fleet, transport fleet, to natural gas. And we did that in record time. But it was a very intense learning process for me, because suddenly you realize, okay, the world, you knew it, no longer is there, and you have to invent solutions. And you haven't got time to change the vehicles. You have to keep the wheels going. So the only solution you can have in a times of emergency is retrofitting something to the existing system, retrofitting something to existing transport equipment, cars, bus, trucks, and so on. You haven't got time for anything else. And that's the situation we are getting into globally. But people are blind. People are still blind about it.
Yeah, and what we're doing, and I think that's the next slide. What we're doing, well, before we get into the problems with the renewables, which seems to be the solution, right? That's the solution. Is the solar and wind and even geothermal. But what this slide shows, and it's on your website, that the green part of this chart is what is actual useful energy from everything all the energy sources that we're using or extracting. And then the tan or orange area, that is the waste of the
Yeah.
energy. Could you explain this chart?
That chart describes what we started talking about earlier on, is the fact that we started the Industrial Revolution about 270 years ago with steam engines about 2% efficient, and now we are about 12% efficient. So we use an enormous amount of fossil fuels, but 88% of it is wasted. And that's the yellow, orangey, tan part of the diagram. And the actual amount of work we get out of it, useful energy, is the green part. And that's why we are in trouble. If we had been a bit more careful and mindful and used thermodynamics, the knowledge of thermodynamics properly, we would not be in that situation now. The bulk of this huge surge of global energy fossil fuel use is wasted. And very few people realize that. If they don't see it because they analyze things in dollars or euros or whatever, they don't actually see what is actually taking place in physical terms. And what matters for living and surviving is physical terms, not paper money.
Maybe if people would look at the energy as in food. So if they buy, let's say, 100 pounds of food, they bring into their house in the refrigerator, but they're only eating 12% of it. I mean, I know some people don't finish all their food, but they bring the food in, they cook it, and then at the end of the week, they're throwing out 88 pounds of that food. They just throw it outside the house. They're not even going to use it, right?
It's a good parallel.
That's exactly what we're doing. We're taking this good quality energy, and so the symptoms of pollution and of the climate and global warming, that's all due to the inefficient use of our energy system.
Absolutely. The yellow, orange, tan part in the diagram, that is the climate emergency. That's what is generating the global warming and get us into trouble.
So throughout the whole energy system, whether it's a coal-fired plant that generates electricity, and then it sends it down the transmission lines, and then it goes into uh, these different facilities, and it finally gets into your house. What you're saying is the entire system is only 12% efficient, 88% is waste.
That's right.
And
And there are various estimates. They vary a bit from country to country and researcher to researcher. but it's all around that ballpark.
About 12%. Now, this next slide that you have on your website, you explain that the Earth system, when it takes in solar energy from the sun, the Earth system is 80% efficient compared
It,
to compared
yeah,
to the 12% energy system that humans have used. Would you explain that?
yeah. In rough term, the life on Earth, so we call it Earth life, uh, is actually it's a very complex system, but it has evolved around 3.8 billion years to recycle energy. It's evolved to become very complex. Photosynthesis in itself is about 1% efficient, but the way life on Earth recycle things compensate for that. So everybody these days have heard of the so-called Gaia concept developed by Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock. I don't like the term, and a number of my fellow scientists don't like the term, because Gaia was an earth goddess to which humans offered human sacrifices for thousands of years. So it's a bit gruesome, and it's anthropomorphizing something which has nothing to do with humans. So instead of talking of Gaia, we prefer to talk of Earth life. It says what it is. It's the whole ecosystem of the Earth operating as a self-organizing, self-perpetuating, self-regulating system. That system makes, roughly speaking, over 80% productive use of the energy it receives from the sun. So overall, it's actually very effective. If we had done something similar, if we had emulated that using our knowledge of thermodynamics, which we developed over the last 270 years, instead of the huge energy waste, which you can see at the top of the diagram, we would have the green part plus a bit of energy waste, the blue part. Way down. We wouldn't use that huge amount of fossil fuel. We could still be using fossil fuels, but without generating that huge amount of carbon dioxide and methane and so on. We would not have global warming, and we would have plenty of time to actually convert and move on from fossil fuels to solar. Now, the challenge we face, this fourth transition we talked about earlier on, is to move very abruptly from the top of the peak of that mountain up there down to the blue and green part. It is feasible, but it has to be done using different modes of thinking, different modes of doing engineering, and so on. My group, my colleagues and I know how to do it. The difficulty we face is to be heard and to get the money to do it. But it is feasible in a nick of time. If we miss that spot, which we call the gold spot, which we saw at the beginning of a discussion, it will become irretrievable. Well, we can still do it in a nick of time. Reduce enormously the energy wastage and arrive at what we should have been doing for 270 years. And in the process, we can bring to very comfortable way of living the people we currently don't have energy or are energy deprived. There is at least 4 billion people worldwide who are severely energy deprived. And if we transform reduce the energy wastage the way we propose, we can actually make available energy to those people very affordably and change the way their quality of life.
So what you're saying is, if we're looking at this like in a football game, or let's say a U.S. football game, but a lot of Americans are watching this. as well as globally, but there's four quarters in a football game, and you've got four quarters to win that game. Where would you say we are now to make this transition? What part of the football game are we in right now?
I must confess, I'm not very familiar with the
Oh,
game.
okay. So, would you say we're towards the end, right? We don't have much time. We don't have,
We should do it by yesterday.
yes. So there's not much time left in the game to get this done, because the longer you wait, the less probability of allowing the transition to occur.
Absolutely. This is what I was saying. We can do it still, but in nick of time. Remember what we discussed earlier on. Everything depends on net energy from oil. The way we are using oil at the moment is extremely wasteful, and the game is effectively over. We are extracting the last dregs of net energy from oil right now. Within the next few years, that will be over. So
So,
effectively, the game is over. If we don't change very, very rapidly, very abruptly, we go down irretrievably down the energy cliff.
unfortunate, that seems to be happening much quicker nowadays. Now, you did mention this, and before we get into, and we're towards the end of this, we're getting towards the end of the interview. I wanted you to provide a little bit information on what you see as the solution to accessing this waste energy. And I'm going to do another interview with you to go over the problems again briefly, and then to allow you the opportunity to, in more detail, tell us what the solution that you and the other engineers and scientists that you're working with are trying to do to tap into this waste energy, and to allow us to make that transition away from the cliff to what you see as a more efficient solar energy system. But you, in this chart or this graphic that's on your website, you say renewables are not quite renewable. And could you briefly explain what's happening here with the wind, and again, make it a brief explanation of what's happening with these wind turbines and why wind turbine power is not a real solution.
Right. That picture you see there struck me when I saw it a few years ago. It's what's called a Hans Rev wind farm in Denmark. At the time, it was the largest offshore wind farm in the world. And a researcher took that picture. He was flying there to study the problems with the wind farm. And he was lucky in the sense that the way the moisture was in the wind at the time, made it visible the turbulences created by the wind farm. And you see that the first row of wind turbines is working fine, and downwind, the change of pressure in the causing by the movement of the turbines creates this mist, which makes the turbulences visible. A wind turbine is like a huge fan. It generates a lot of turbulences, and in thermodynamic terms, that's called entropy. And you can see that the wind turbines which are downstream are completely immersed in that turbulence flow, which means that they can turn a bit, but they're not able to actually extract much energy in the wind. The second row of wind farm extracts a bit. The third row of that wind farm extracts far less. By the time you reach the fourth row, you practically don't generate any significant energy at all. So now that problem was not apparent at the time, but discovered it painfully in a very expensive manner, because a wind farm like that costs a heck of a lot. And we now know that to avoid that problem, the rows of wind turbines must be roughly, in most instances, some 60 kilometers apart. Otherwise, the downstream wind turbines are losing money compared with the upstream. which means that wind is actually a mining industry. You mine the best sites. It's like the gold rush. The guys arriving first where the gold is win and the others lose. So that example shows that wind is actually complicated and it's not easy to actually generate net energy from wind. Just using that example, what I mentioned before is related to that. If you want to replace fossil fuel use with wind, you actually warm up the land or the sea downwind. In addition, obviously, as you were pointing out, Steve, earlier on, somebody has to make those machines, whether it's photovoltaics or wind, and that actually costs a lot of energy. Plus a lot of pollution because you have to mine things, you have to mine rare earth metal, for example, and that's very, very polluting. And you have to burn a lot of coal, amongst other things, to produce the steel, to produce the aluminium, to produce the glass and everything else involved. The wind turbines blades are made fundamentally out of, they are composites. They require a lot of plastics derived from oil, and by and large, they're not recyclable. So in a mine to grave perspective, renewables are not really renewable. And as the last point in that slide shows, when you look at it in dynamic terms, not just a wind farm at a time or a solar farm at a time, but the whole system, from mine to grave, the energy return on energy investment is way below 10 to 1. And 10 to 1 is a bare minimum to have a civilized society, not quite civilized. To have a proper society like we like to live in, you need to be above 30 to 1 at the wellhead or at the wind farm or at the solar farm level. And at the moment, there is no way we can achieve that with wind or solar. And it's even worse on biomass.
I know, I find that amazing that they think by going in and chopping down forests and then grinding them up into pulp and burning it. They call this renewable. It's like, it's really insane. And
It is insane, absolutely insane. Yes, I agree.
It's so insane. And then, of course, when you get to the next slide, this is an estimate of what the total amount of wind turbine blade waste is going to be. It's supposed to be 50,000 metric tons in 2020, and it goes up exponentially. And so when you talk about waste, there you go. Not only is the wind power system wasteful, as in it's inefficient, there's a lot of loss in this system when it's functioning, then you've got to get rid of these old wind blades and replace them. And that's a physical waste, which is not, you don't hear that being talked about by many of the people in the wind industry.
No, they don't like to talk about that. But it's a reality. And in Europe, a lot of those turbines, blades, end up in dumps in Africa.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, there are a few startups trying to convert them. I know of startups trying to make urban furniture like benches and things like that out of wind turbines, but there's a limit to how many benches in a city you can flog out of wind blades.
That's correct. And so what happens to these wind blades, most of them, probably 90% or more, is right here. They get cut up. They get cut up and they put in landfills. And this is the same thing that's going to happen with the solar panels, because from what I understand, the collection, the dismantling, the collecting, the transportation, breaking apart the solar panel, and then putting it through a recycling system. And then you get the, let's say, the metal or the components. It's too costly for what the value of the the materials you get from recycling them. So this is the exact same problem we're going to have with solar panels. They're going to be dumped into landfills.
Yeah, absolutely. It's expensive and it's someone else's problem. You know, I've discussed with chief executives of wind farms in Europe, and it's not their problem. Their problem is to make money, and until now, it's changing progressively. But until now, they have it very good because they have contracts with various governments uh, with guaranteed electricity prices for 25 years typically. So the cash register keeps ticking, and what's going to happen next is not their problem. They are profitable, their business is to be profitable, and that's all that counts from their point of view. But that doesn't solve our problem, which is the thermodynamic cliff we are now looking at.
And
I
that's
suppose going over the cliff.
and that's a perfect transition because, well, the next slide is going to be the thermodynamic cliff. And I just wanted to show this because Toyota is, they're one of the larger global automobile manufacturers. And
Mhm.
what's interesting, for some reason, the market believes that Tesla is the future. And
Mhm.
so the market cap of Tesla, when I did this chart, was three times that of Toyota. But Toyota produced almost 2.4 million vehicles in the US. This is just the US, whereas
Mhm.
Tesla only produced 8% of that number. So even the EV, the electric vehicle market, the entire supply chain, the entire electric vehicle market, that's just another version of the wind and solar. It's another very inefficient solution, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's pure. In my view, it's completely delusional. Now there is a niche market for specific purposes for electric vehicles, but is no way that can actually get us out of trouble.
Would you say that
And
it,
the valuation of Tesla, in my view, is completely delusional. It's people not realizing the physical reality of the situation we're in.
so the
They believe in paper money, and it's totally misplaced belief.
So would you agree that again, this is what's simply amazing to me, Louis, is that all this money, which is really energy, all the energy that we're investing into these different supposedly alternative green or renewable, it's just making the situation worse, correct?
It is making the situation worse. Plus, if one does the sum, one does the sum, as some of us engineers like to do, we like to look at the full system. There is not enough lithium in the world to replace the current global fleet of transport vehicle, without mentioning the shipping industry and the airline industry. It's just light transport vehicles. There is not enough lithium to replace current trucks, light trucks and cars. We're talking about 1.3 billion vehicles worldwide. There's not lithium to replace them with electric vehicles. So it's an impossibility.
So it does seem like the blind is leading the blind, which gets us to the next, which gets us to your chart again. And
Yeah.
we've discussed this, and we this has gone a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'm glad we went into the details, and we're going to now get into briefly what your solution is of tapping into this inefficient waste energy to allow us to move into away from the thermodynamic cliff is going to happen. That's not a question. That's going to happen. Now, either we get smart and we transition into this 100% sustainable efficient solar system, or we go over the thermodynamic cliff. So that's what we're at right now.
Absolutely, that's where we are. I mean, when you say it's going to happen, it is happening now.
Yes, it is.
The pandemic has actually precipitated that. We were getting close to the cliff. We are now reaching the edge of the cliff. And the next few years are going to be very critical in terms of whether we make the jump to something else or we go down the cliff.
And so,
We are at the point right now.
yes. And so what you have been working on for quite a while, and this is the problem with the with your ENGINE technology class. It's not just like a what do you call it? A product. It's not the product of inventing a new product or new technology. The problem is educating the people or the leaders or the CEOs who are in charge of running the entire system to make them understand, or at least enough people to understand, that the problem is the inefficient energy, and we can't move the major oil industry from oil into these green, inefficient solutions. So you have this ENGINE solution. Could you briefly explain what that is?
Yeah.
And then we're going to go into the 5 principles, and I want you to also briefly explain them as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve, for that. The why is it called a technology class? As you pointed out, it's not a product, is the knowledge to make products which are efficient. The point to realize in terms of what we have been discussing to this point is that the technology means we have can't get us out of trouble. In other terms, we are using at the moment 4 main classes of technology. We are using internal combustion engines, and that's a technology class. There are millions of different types of internal combustion engines in use at the moment, from things like operating a chainsaw or lawnmower to a Formula One racing car and just about everything in between. They all function with cylinders, pistons, valves, etc. They are internal combustion engines. That class has reached the end of its life. We can't get out of trouble if we keep using internal combustion engines. The same applies to turbines. There are millions of different types of turbines: steam turbines, gas turbines used in power stations, gas turbine used in jet engines to fly aeroplanes, and as we have seen, wind turbines. They're all turbines. They're all based on the same kind of principles. They are far too inefficient. We can't use that either to get out of trouble. The same as we have seen with photovoltaics. Using photovoltaics doesn't change the equation. We still remain around 12% energy efficiency overall, and that's not good enough. And the same with battery energy storage. If we use renewables, we need a form of storage. When we use fossil fuel, the fossil fuel itself is energy storage. If we use the sun or the wind, we need batteries in one form or another. And what we've got in terms of batteries at the moment can't get us out of trouble. Like there is not enough lithium. We can't yet recycle the lithium property and so on. So that doesn't work. So those 4 energy conversion technology classes are effectively now obsolete. And we need something else. So ENGINE is my solution, my proposed solution for that something else, to move from 88%, roughly speaking, energy wastage to over 80% productive use of energy. That's what the ENGINE is designed to do. So with that technology class, we can generate a wide array of applications, a wide array of products for transport on land, at sea, and in the air, and for power generation in home, in residential settings, in commercial settings, and in industry. That's what the technology class and Jenny enables us to do. And that's what we want to demonstrate, and why we are uh, hunting for the right funding to do the demonstration.
And I believe that a good example to understand this Jenny technology class is the transition, well, the movement from the vacuum tube to the transistor technology. Is that similar?
It is similar in the sense that when the around the time when I was born in 1947, the transistor as a piece of electronic device was invented and demonstrated. At the time, you were doing electronics with vacuum tubes. They were bulky, they were elegant. For example, a hi-fi sound system using vacuum tubes can have very, very high quality. But they were expensive, fragile, and you couldn't make a large computer with these things. So when the transistor was demonstrated, it was a bulky, somewhat clumsy device. It proved the point, but it was not a product. It was not immediately translatable into commercial products. It was a demonstration of what it could do. And some people understood the potential and jumped on it. And others shrugged their shoulders and decided to stick with vacuum tubes. The guys who kept with vacuum tubes were the losers. The people who saw the potential of the transistor were the winners. To a company which very early saw the potential were Texas Instruments and Sony, and the rest is history. We moved very rapidly to microelectronics, particularly in what became Silicon Valley with Fairchild Industries. And beyond that, a few decades later, we had the PC, and then the internet, and then the smartphone, and here we are today.
Okay.
So with energy, we are saying it's the same thing. If we demonstrate a new technology class, we are at the level we were with the transistor when I was born in 1947. And we opened the door for a complete transformation, enabling us to access a huge amount of solar energy and actually carry out the fourth transition.
And unfortunately, different than the transition of the vacuum tube to the transistor, there isn't that luxury of time, is there?
That's right. We have to do that in a hell of a hurry. So a lot of our work effort over the last few years has been to figure out how to do it quick and how to enable people to make the jump. At the moment, we have plenty of people worldwide demonstrating. Young people are going on strikes to the Fridays for Future. In Europe, we have Extinction Rebellion demonstrating, blocking streets in London and so on. They won't change. They understand enough that if we don't change, we are finished. But there is one thing to demonstrate and say we won't change. The question is, if there is no means to change effectively, change won't happen. So our focus is to actually give people the means of changing, whether they are at home, at work, in transport, and so on. People at the moment haven't got the means. They are willing to change, they want to change, but they haven't got the tools to do it. Our work, our pioneering work, is to give everybody the means to change.
And that brings us to the next slide, which is the 5 principles of sustainable power. Now, this is important because I've had some people, in playing devil's advocate, some people said, well, Steve, I've listened to Dr. Louis Arnoux, and yeah, he's talking about the energy cliff, but then he conveniently comes up with this solution. And so I think they don't understand that 2 things before we get into this. Number one, everything that we're investing in for a solution is really garbage. it's inefficient. It doesn't work. It makes the situation worse, the energy situation worse. So that's the number one thing. The number two thing is we're supposed to put on the pedestal inventors, entrepreneurs, and people who try to come up with these solutions that actually benefit us. And not solutions that make things worse. And so I think it's very important that people look at what you're trying to put forward, because it's not a gadget that you're trying to invent. You've told me that the technology is already there. The problem is you're trying to get people to understand this is a new technology class that taps into the waste energy. So you've got these five different principles. Instead of going into each one of them in this interview, we'll do that in more detail in the next. Could you kind of explain what these five principles are?
Right, absolutely. First, let me say that with hindsight, it's simple, but it took me a long while to arrive at those five principles. All right. It was at the outset, it was not obvious. And that's possibly why no one else has done it before. With hindsight, we can say, yes, we should have done that before. We should have done that hundreds of years ago, but we didn't. So now it's time to do it and do it in a hell of a hurry. So let me say simply, if we have a central power station, which is typically at best 50% energy efficient, and the power station generates, say, 100 megawatt of electricity, it means that it also generates 100 megawatt of waste heat. And at a given point where the power station is located, 100 megawatt of waste heat is far too much. We can't use it. We can't recycle it effectively. If we want to make use of the waste heat intelligently and effectively, we have to do it at the point of use where people use energy, in a home, in the shopping center, in the factory, in the hospital, in the school. And there, the necessity is to do it at a small scale. There are very few places in industry where you use more than 1 megawatt of energy at a given point. We're talking of few kilowatts in a home to a few tens of kilowatt, maybe 100 kilowatt of power at a given point in time. So you have to do it small scale and recycle the energy at the point of use. And that's the first principle. And then you have to do it efficiently, and you look at what thermodynamic cycle, as it's called, to use. And we will come back that I understand to that in the next interview. But the best cycle to use, it's well known, is the Brayton-Erickson thermodynamic cycle, because that enables you to go above 50% energy efficiency. If you do it well, we will go towards 60% and eventually around 70% efficiency at the point of use. Same thing, we are going to use either a fuel, even sometime we could use fossil fuels, but do it efficiently. Or we can use the sun, a concentrated solar, beaming the sun on the solar receiver. To do that, you have to think in terms of external combustion or converting the heat to something clean, which is compressed air. That's the third principle. Use external combustion or use solar, and inside your device, you only have clean compressed air, which also enables you to process the air, because if your device is going to use air from the atmosphere, you might as well recycle the CO2 in it. So you can do direct air capture of the CO2, which is what our technology enables to do financially effectively, cost effectively. And to do that, you have to find the right efficient technology. You're not never going to be efficient if you use pistons and cylinders. You're not never going to be efficient using turbines. Large turbine can be about 40%, 50% efficient, but we have said we don't want to use large installations. We have to do things at the point of use at a small scale. At a small scale, a gas turbine or a steam turbine is about 5% efficient. So you're not going to use turbines to do what we want to do. So we have found another category of mechanical device called positive displacement machines, which enables us to do that. Interestingly enough, the main version was demonstrated successfully in the late 50s and the 60s. But at the time, the general orientation was for large power station using large gas turbines. So the guys who invented that and demonstrated that successfully back then never managed to commercialize that, and it went on the shelf and was forgotten. We are reviving that, and we are adding our own intellectual property to it to achieve very high level of efficiency. And the fifth principle, the fifth point, is to network that. And we know, thanks to what we have learned about the internet, we know how to generate, to deploy very efficient networks combining broadband communications on the one hand and energy networking on the other. To operate a power grid, you need a communication network to ensure that everything runs right at the substation, at the transformers, and so on. So as I keep saying, broadband requires energy, and so broadband requires juice in colloquial terms, and juice requires broadband. The two go hand in hand together. We have found a way of networking both energy and communications very efficiently. So with those 5 principles, we can actually change completely how we access and use energy to achieve overall efficiency above 80%.
And so that is basically the NGenny technology class, is tapping into the inefficient energy.
That's right, absolutely.
Which is causing all the problems.
Which is causing all the problems. And if we retrieve the current energy wastage, it means a lot of money. And when you pay $100, say, or 100 euros to refuel a vehicle, or pay the electricity bill in a home or in a business environment, at least $88 will go into smoke somewhere. If we retrieve the wastage, we retrieve that amount of money. And we have figured out that we can retrieve a substantial amount of the wastage and convert it into funds, which are currently lost. And that globally is more than $5 trillion or 5 trillion euros per year. So we are talking big. We're talking a large amount of funds we can retrieve for shifting to sustainable modes of living and doing business eventually 100% solar-based. That's what we are up to.
So in conclusion, Louis, let me ask you this. If you had to put a date, I'm not going to hold you to it, but when would this have to be massively adapted by? What would be, of course, you can't do it starting in 5, 10 years, and then it gets it takes time to scale up, correct? And nothing happens overnight. But when is the date that you see where this becomes no longer a solution? It's not a viable solution. We've gone over the point of no return. What year would that be?
Let me say it that way. If we get the funding we are currently trying to raise, within 18 months, we have a demonstration of the technology potential. Where I cut my teeth, as I was saying earlier on when I was a bit younger, was in the wake of the second oil shock, when we achieve in 5 years' time what was meant to happen, meant to take 15 or 20 years. We accelerated the process, and I learned how to accelerate the process of technology diffusion, technology substitution, and uptake. So based on that experience and everything I learned ever since, we are confident that we can turn things around globally over 20 years. In other terms, moving from 0% uptake to market saturation above 90% in 20 years globally. It is still doable. It's tough. It's not mission impossible, but it's tough, but it can be done. And we know how to do it because meanwhile, we also learn how the internet took off, for example. It took off very rapidly, much more rapidly than many other innovations. So we have learned a lot of lessons which we can bring to bear to do this. So within 18 months, we can demonstrate and convince people to go with our technology. Within 3 years, we could break even. And beyond that, it's feasible to generalize, have a very thorough uptake of the technology globally and have a completely different situation within 20 years.
And the thing is, it would have to start soon because you have said that by 2030 plus or minus, we start hitting that thermodynamic cliff. We start going off of it considerably. And so the thing is, but there is a bit of give. So the thing is, you're running against the oil clock, correct?
That's right. We are in a hell of a hurry. Let's put it that way. I mean, one colleague I'm negotiating with at the moment, who is a very brilliant engineer here in Harlem, summarized the situation, and he said, look, I agree with you with your analysis, and he wants to be involved. And he says, well, look, put crudely, we are screwed. Give us 10 million euros to demonstrate how to get out of trouble. And I said, yes, well, it's a crude way of putting it, but you're right.
Well, we've come to the end, and I'm glad that you were able to explain the problem that we faced, more of an update, and to tell you the truth, when you on your different, you've got a couple of different websites. When I saw that the energy system was that inefficient, you would think that's common sense. Just seeing those charts, how inefficient the energy system is. And so even though I understood the thermodynamic cliff, I did realize there was waste heat, there was waste, in the electric generation of power through the transmission lines. I knew there was waste, but when you put that one chart, those two charts on your website, and you showed us that the system is so inefficient, and because it's so inefficient, it's causing all these problems, maybe the global warming and pollution, and it's very inefficient. And at a time now with the energy that we're using is starting to run out of net energy, this is the problem we're facing. So let me ask you this. We are going to do a second interview in the next few weeks. We'll put that together, talk a little bit more about the problem, maybe a few more little details, and then provide more information about the solution. But if people wanted to get in contact with you, could you tell us either some websites or how they could get in contact?
Yes, so you have gone back to the first slide there, which shows the gold spot. We are there just in the gold spot where changing game can be extremely profitable. But as you said, if we don't do it, then we go down the gurgler. The best way to contact me is through our website, which is fourthtransitionwealth.com. Have you got a way of showing that on screen, Steve?
Yes, I'll have it, and it's also going to be on the website too. So I will make
Okay.
sure that
So
we show that. So it's at fourth transition.
wealth.com,
All right.
www.fourthtransitionwealth.com.
Okay.
There you will have the summary of what we're doing and how to contact us. Um, Basically, write to info at wealth transition, sorry, fourthtransitionwealth.com.
Okay.
Info at fourthtransitionwealth.com will reach us.
Well, Louis, any closing remarks? Because I think this was a very detailed interview. I'm glad that we finally were able to reach out and talk, because I wake up every morning and it's just amazing to me to see what these solutions that the leaders and the business, that not only the politicians, the leaders, even the business leaders, all these solutions are going in the wrong direction. And so, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of time to fix this problem, or it's going to be collapse and chaos, correct?
Absolutely correct. I mean, sometimes people ask me to summarize, and I say, well, for 270 years, we have done more of the same. And people say, well, how come we now have advanced cars, jet planes? It's not more of the same. I say, yes, for 270 years, we have done more energy inefficient stuff piled on top of more energy inefficient stuff. We have increased the complexity of what we use, of our life, of our industries. We've done more and more complexity, more and more inefficiency without changing the game. That's what more of the same means. And unless we do that very rapidly now, unless we change, we're finished. We have a this is what the gold spot means. We have an opportunity to generate something highly profitable in the nick of time. That's the core of it. What we have figured out is that this is why we are called wealth, fourth transition wealth, because if we don't do it, there is going to be a massive amount of wealth destruction worldwide over the next few years. And in turn, if we do it, we generate a huge amount of wealth. And this is the only way out. It's only if it is very profitable, very attractive, that people would jump on it and make use of it. People demonstrating, asking governments to change, it's not going to happen. And there is no, I keep analyzing what people publish, like the so-called famous new Green New Deals. They are not feasible. None of that is going to get us out of trouble. Current governments are not equipped to do that. Transitions have never been done by governments, they have been done by pioneers. And that is what we are doing. This is where the future wealth is located, in that gold spot.
Well, thank you very much, Louis. And again, would you repeat your website to get in contact?
Yes, www.fourthtransitionwealth, all in one word.com.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Louis. We again will do another interview in a few weeks to talk more about the solution. And I think if people understood more about the solution, they would see that it makes a lot of sense, because there's so much money and energy being thrown at the wrong solution, which is actually not a solution. It's a problem. We're throwing money at problems. We need to look at the real solution. So I thank you for coming at the SRS Rock Report.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was very, very interesting to go through that. Thank you enormously.
All right. You have a good day.
You too. Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye.